I have never been a patient man. Anyone who has sat across from me at a board of trustees will tell you so, and I would not argue the point. I arrived at Greymere Charity School for Orphaned Girls on the third Thursday of October with the full intention of enduring 1 hour, signing the annual ledger of donations, and returning to my carriage before the first examiner had finished clearing his throat. I did not expect to still be there at 4:30. Greymere was my father's charity, not mine. He had built the school 40 years before on a patch of Southwark land worth nothing and filled it with girls worth everything, or so he always said. I had continued the endowment because it would have been unkind to stop it, and because I understood in the abstract that educating orphaned girls was a sound moral enterprise. I did not understand it in any way that made me feel anything in particular. I attended the annual public examination because the school's director, a small, urgent woman named Mrs. Hatch, had written to me 4 years running that my presence gave the girls an example of civic seriousness, which I suspected meant she needed my name on the program to draw other patrons. I sat in the front row of the examination hall in my good coat and prepared to be civic. The hall was not large. 30 girls ranged in rows, their gray pinafores pressed to a severity that suggested considerable effort, a long table of examiners at the front, a scattering of patrons behind me. The examiners were a vicar, a physician, a retired schoolmaster named Colebrook who smelled of pipe tobacco and self-regard, and an empty chair where the fourth examiner, a classic scholar from a college whose name I have since forgotten, had failed to appear. Mrs. Hatch was visibly distressed about the empty chair. I watched her confer in rapid whispers with a woman standing near the wall, and I prepared to offer Colebrook the name of a replacement. Then the woman near the wall stepped forward. I had not looked at her before. She had been standing precisely where one does not look, against the whitewashed plaster between two high windows, hands folded, wearing a plain brown dress that matched the wall closely enough to be a consideration rather than an accident. She was not young in the way of the girls, perhaps 26 or 28, and she was not dressed to be noticed. She said something quiet to Mrs. Hatch. Mrs. Hatch's face collapsed with relief. The woman sat down at the empty chair, opened the examination folder she had apparently been holding the entire time, and looked up at the hall. "We will begin with natural philosophy," she said. "Miss Aldrin, if you please." Her name, I would learn later, was Louisa Fenn. She had come to Greymere as a girl of 9, the daughter of no one in particular, and she had stayed. That was the whole of her biography as the school understood it. She had been teaching the youngest forms their letters and sums for 4 years, supplementing Mrs. Hatch's salary by 3 shillings a week, and she was considered reliable and undemanding. That was the whole of the school's understanding of her. I watched her conduct an examination for 2 hours. The girls were good, better than I had expected, and I had expected nothing, but it was the examiner I could not stop watching. She listened to each answer with a stillness that was not the stillness of patience but of attention, the kind of attending that hears what is actually being said rather than waiting for the speaking to stop. When an answer was wrong she did not correct it immediately, she asked a question that led the girl to the correction herself, and I watched girls of 12 and 13 arrive at ideas they had not known they held, their faces changing as they did. When an answer was right she did not praise it extravagantly. She moved on, and the absence of excessive praise was itself a kind of respect. Then Colebrook, who had been examining the Latin section with the confidence of a man who had not revisited the subject since his own schooling, read a passage aloud and posed a question of translation that produced 3 wrong answers in succession. He looked satisfied at this, in the manner of examiners who mistake difficulty for quality. The fourth girl, a thin-wristed child of perhaps 13 named Briggs, sat with her hands pressed flat to her desk and said nothing. "The construction is unusual," Louisa Fenn said, without looking up from the folder. "The verb is deponent. The girls have not been taught deponent verbs, they are not in the prescribed curriculum." Colebrook looked at her. "Quite so," he said, with the tone of a man who had just been contradicted by a chair. "Nevertheless, a girl of enterprise might have." "A girl of enterprise," she said, still without raising her voice, "might have read ahead of the prescribed curriculum. Several of them have. But it seems ungenerous to mark them against knowledge they were not provided." She looked at the girl with the pressed flat hands. "Miss Briggs, do you know what a deponent verb is?" The girl's face changed. "Yes, miss." "Then tell me." And the girl told her, correctly, in full, with the precision of someone who had been taught this particular thing by someone who had considered how it ought to be explained, and not by the prescribed curriculum. The hall was quiet for a moment. I looked at Colebrook. Colebrook looked at his folder. Louisa Fenn wrote something down. I did not leave at 4 o'clock. I waited until the hall had emptied, the girls filing out in their pressed pinafores, the patrons collecting their coats, Colebrook departing with a dignity that required some visible effort, and then I went to find Mrs. Hatch. Mrs. Hatch was effusive and grateful and told me that Miss Fenn had stepped in beautifully and wasn't it fortunate she had been there, and she hoped I had found the girls impressive, and I said yes, very, and asked where Miss Fenn had gone. She was in the school garden. It was a small garden, a rectangle of packed earth with 4 plain trees and a stone bench worn smooth by decades of girls sitting on it. She was standing near the far wall with a notebook open in her hand, writing something, her back to the door. She heard me come in and turned, and for the first time I saw her face properly rather than in profile across a hall. She was not what I would have thought to call beautiful, if I had been asked to describe her before I spoke to her. Afterwards, I could not have told you what I had been thinking of. She had a steady, direct quality in her face that made everything else beside the point. "Your Grace," she said, without surprise or particular deference, in the tone of someone who had been told to expect this and had decided to get through it efficiently. "You taught Miss Briggs the deponent verbs," I said. A pause. "I taught her a number of things not in the curriculum." "On your own time, I imagine." "There isn't much other time." I asked if I could sit down. She looked at the stone bench as though she was calculating whether this would make the conversation longer, and then she sat down on it herself, which I took as permission. What followed was not what I had planned to say. I had planned to say something about the examination, offer some form of official recognition, a small increase to her wage perhaps, or a letter of commendation, and feel that I had done a decent thing. Instead I found myself asking her what else she taught. She was not inclined to answer. I asked again. She closed the notebook. "Geometry through the 3rd book of Euclid," she said. "Natural philosophy through the standard introductory texts, and one I wrote myself for the parts the texts explain poorly. Latin through Livy. French through conversation, not grammar tables are how languages die. And some mathematics. Proper mathematics, not sums. To how many girls? To the ones who wanted it." She looked at the plain trees. 7, at present. There were 11, but 4 have left to go into service. And the school's official curriculum does not include any of it. The official curriculum prepares girls to be useful in households and grateful for the opportunity. She said it without bitterness, which was worse than bitterness would have been. It was simply how things were. "I work in the evenings, after supper. The girls come voluntarily." I sat with that for a moment. "Why?" I said. Not why did she teach them, I understood that. Why had no one noticed? Why had no one asked? Why had the name Louisa Fenn appeared nowhere in the 4 years of annual reports I had signed and returned without reading with any care? She looked at me. "Why what, Your Grace? Why has no one done anything about this before?" "Because," she said, with a patience that had the edges worn off it, "no one has looked." I went home that evening and read the last 4 annual reports. She was mentioned once, in the 3rd, in a list of staff, as Miss L. Fenn, teaching assistant, lower forms, Greymere since 1809. That was the whole of it. I came back the following week. She was not expecting me and did not adjust her expression to suggest she was pleased. I asked to see the natural philosophy text she had written herself. She brought it, a bound notebook of 60 pages, the handwriting precise, the diagrams drawn in 2 colors of ink, the explanations beginning with what a girl already understood before building to what she did not yet know. It was, without question, the clearest piece of mathematical prose I had read since my own tutor's hand. Also without question, unpublished, unknown, sitting in a schoolroom drawer in Southwark. "Has anyone else seen this?" I said. "Mrs. Hatch," she said. She thought it was very thorough. I came back a 3rd time, a week after that. She told me that Miss Briggs had asked about astronomy. And I said I would have to find a text. She looked at the teapot. "I haven't yet." "I have a library," I said. "Greymere House. There are 3 astronomical texts in the East Room that have not been opened since my father's time." If Miss Briggs wants them, she should have them. She said, after a moment, that's kind. It is not especially kind, I said. It is the least that ought to have been done some years ago. I don't know precisely when I understood that I was going to ask her to marry me. It gathered over those 3 weeks the way November gathers, quietly, until one morning you look out the window and the light has changed entirely and you cannot say when it did. I spent the following week arguing with myself about the propriety of it, and whether it was appropriate to offer marriage to a woman who had, if anything, given me the clear impression that she found my visits reasonable but not a particular joy. I went back on a gray Tuesday morning in November and sat on the stone bench in the garden. She came out, saw me, and sat on the other end of it. I would like to ask you something, I said. She looked at the plane trees. I imagine you will whether I encourage you or not. I would like to marry you, I said. I want to say clearly that this is not an impulse or a charitable gesture or a response to the examination. I have thought about it for some time. I paused. I am also aware that you have no particular reason to think well of me, and that I have been the patron of this school for 4 years without having read a single report carefully, and that you are owed an apology for that which I am prepared to make separately from this question. She was quiet for long enough that I began to consider what I would say when she said no. Why, she said. Not coldly. With the same quality of attention she gave to examination answers, the kind that wanted to hear what was actually being said. Because, I said, you have spent 4 years improving the world quietly and asking for nothing back, and I have never met anyone who did that, and I find that I cannot imagine spending the rest of my life in the company of someone who doesn't. Another silence. A plane tree dropped a leaf. Somewhere inside the school, a girl was reciting something in what I was fairly certain was French. I would want, she said slowly, to continue teaching. Yes, I said. Obviously. And I would want the curriculum changed. Properly. With funding. Yes. And I would want Miss Briggs to have those astronomical texts before Christmas. I will send them tomorrow, I said. Today, if you prefer. She turned and looked at me directly for the first time since I had sat down. All right, she said. We were married in the school's small chapel in December, on a morning with frost on the stone sills and the plane trees bare. Mrs. Hatch wept. 7 girls in gray pinafores sat in the first pew, and Miss Briggs held a sprig of winter ivy she had been told was an appropriate thing to hold, and held it with the solemnity of a girl who had recently learned the names of 3 constellations and intended to learn the rest. Louisa stood beside me and addressed the color of winter sky and did not perform happiness, which was how I knew it was real. She simply turned toward me with the same steady quality she gave to everything, the direct attention, the clarity, the patience worn to its useful edge, and she said yes to the question when the moment came, as she had said it to me in the garden, without embellishment. Afterwards, when the girls had gone back to their lessons and Mrs. Hatch was somewhere recovering herself with tea, I stood at the chapel door and watched the frost on the plane trees catch the pale December light. She is nobody's daughter. That is what they said, and they meant it as diminishment, and they were wrong in a way I do not have sufficient words for. She was nobody's daughter, and she made herself every girl's teacher, and the only reason I had not known it sooner is that I had not looked. I do not intend to stop looking now.